Good afternoon, and welcome to Robertson Hall. My name is Cecilia Rouse, and I am the Dean of the Woodrow Wilson School. We're thrilled that as part of the 2013 Richard Ullman Lecture Series, Ngaire Woods, who is the Dean of the Blavatnik School of Government at Oxford University, is here to discuss global governance and development in the 21st century. Dean Woods is also a fellow at the University College at Oxford. She's also been a former advisor to the IMF board, the UNDP's Human Development Report, the Commonwealth Heads of Government, as well as a former host of her own TV series on BBC about public policy. She brings with her an extensive amount of experience in public policy, globalization, and economic development. We're just absolutely thrilled that she's able to be with us here today. And it is now my pleasure to introduce and welcome Robert Cohane, who's a professor of international affairs here at Princeton. And I, unfortunately, have to go to University of Oxford.
So the fate of the dean. I have known Ngaire Woods for 20 years, since she was a postdoctoral fellow at Harvard. It was instantly clear that she was going to be a star, since she was not only interesting, but very irreverent toward the august senior academics in the vicinity. We became friends then and have remained so since. Indeed, for the last 6 years, we have directed the Global Leaders Program, which brings postdoctoral fellows, of whom at least 2 are here today, to Oxford and Princeton from developing countries. Dean Woods is an astute student of globalization and global governance, as her 2006 book, The Globalizers, demonstrates. More than any academic from North America or Europe whom I know, she works with and understands scholars and people involved in public affairs from Africa, Latin America, and Asia. And perhaps the fact that she is by background from the South, a Kiwi, not a Brit, explains her range of understanding. Ngaire Woods founded the school of which she is dean. She had the idea, she raised the money, she organized the search for the dean. Eventually, the search committee on which I served demanded that she become a candidate. The wisdom of our decision has been clear ever since. The school is now in its second year with 68 MPP students from 41 different countries. It has a distinguished and growing faculty, including one of our recent PhDs, and it's about to have a brilliant new building in Oxford. Dean Woods comes to us, therefore, both as an accomplished commentator on globalization and global governance, and as dean of a new sister institution at Oxford. She will speak today on the topic, Why Question Global Governance in the 20th Century? And tomorrow at 4:30 in Bowl 16, her topic will be Less but Better, Making Global Governance Work in the 21st Century. Ngaire, welcome. Thanks for coming.
Thank you. Thank you, Bob. Thanks, Bob. Well, it's an absolutely huge pleasure to be here. It's a pleasure to be back at Princeton, to be in the Woodrow Wilson School, to be among colleagues, many of whom have helped so much in both with research, but also with the founding of the School of Government in Oxford, and I owe a great debt to this place. In fact, 2 of our faculty have Princeton Woodrow Wilson School doctorates, so the bonds between our schools are already firm. It's a particular pleasure to be giving a lecture in honor of Richard Ullman. I first ran into Dick Ullman, and I actually, during his year as Eastman Visiting Professor at Oxford University. And when I say I first ran into him, that, alas, is exactly what I did. I came tearing out of the squash courts of Balliol, which are just in front of the Eastman Visiting Professor's house, and crashed into this distinguished-looking gentleman who seemed completely unperturbed by the fact that I'd practically knocked him over, and instead immediately set about working out what linked us. We worked out we were Rhodes Scholars, and we were, Balliol, New College, all these links. And the next day, Dick had me playing squash with him and was giving me advice on whether I should come to Harvard. He was very enthusiastic about it, and I always thought it was because of the intellectual environment that Harvard would give me. And then before I came over to give this lecture over the weekend, I did a bit more research into Dick's publications and found his 1955 depiction of Harvard as, quote, a place where one does 4 things: shoot pool, drink, dance, and hang around the common room looking for votes. So I now wonder, was this what he thought I would fit so well into? But as a mentor, as a teacher, and as a scholar, Dick is just such a wonderful example to us all. So it's doubly a pleasure to give these lectures. So why question global governance in the 21st century? I mean, globalization, frankly, has been on quite a romp for 30 years. We've seen trade double, treble, quadruple. If we look at the period from 1990, we've seen merchandise trade increase 9-fold in the Middle East, 7-fold in Asia, 6-fold in South and Central America, 5-fold in Africa. We've seen capital, cross-border capital flows increase 20-fold in the period 1980 to 2007. And with that extraordinary growth in economic exchange, which has been genuinely global, has come a need to manage it. And that need was greatly underscored by the 2008 financial crisis. When Lehman Brothers collapsed, global governance was vital. In particular, having a mechanism to bring leaders of the world's 20 most powerful economies together, to have them agree jointly to signal to the markets that they were determined not to shrink back and use beggar-thy-neighbor policies to come out of the crisis. In fact, a week before the G20 met, but as they were preparing to meet, the World Economic Forum held their first Global Agenda Summit in Dubai. And that was rather grandly named Global Redesign. And at that summit, there were some 60 or so different working groups of scholars, commentators, policymakers, private sector people from all over the world, looking into every one of what the WEF had defined as the world's 60 most important problems. And at the end of 3 days, there was one common theme to every single group's report back. And that was that what you needed to solve the problem, whether it was water, malaria, literacy, intellectual property rights, whatever the problem was, every single solution had one thing in common, and that was a plea for more global governance in that area. I was in the working group on global governance, and our conclusion was that you couldn't do much at the global level, and that every one of these groups had to find a way at the non-global level to work on their problem. But with so much need for global governance, so much proof of it, why, you might ask, am I proposing tonight that we question global governance in the 21st century? And there's 2 arguments I'm going to put to you this evening. And one is that global governance itself is changing. It's deglobalizing. There is, as I will describe, a risk that the United States and European Union will soon find themselves in the cockpit, flying a plane in which some of the passengers didn't board, some are on other people's planes, some of them are donning parachutes and getting ready to jump out. And that change needs us to stop and think, well, why is that change happening and what are its consequences? The second reason is that the legitimacy of global governance is also changing. The trade-off and balance between what is legitimate to be doing at the global level and what we see as legitimate at the level of the national is changing, and I think that means we also need to start rethinking and thinking about the case against global governance in the 21st century. But let me start by reminding you of Stephen Krasner's excellent 1985 book, Structural Conflict. In that book, Professor Krasner argues that the third world would be likely in its relations with international organizations only to use those organizations which could enhance not just the wealth, but the power and control of governments. The third world would focus, therefore, on those arms of the United Nations in which one country, one voice would give them a majority. By contrast, they would rebel against the market-oriented international institutions because these institutions would only bring wealth, not wealth plus power and control. And so he argued the North was mistaken in believing that it could make, or those in the North who thought that the main problem was wealth and the poverty of the third world, and therefore believed they could make common cause with, and I'm using the word third world because Krasner uses it throughout his book. So the North was mistaken in believing it could make common cause with the third world in order to build wealth and eradicate poverty. This would not be something the third world would be interested in because power and control were as important as wealth. What's interesting now we look back nearly 30 years later is the extent to which market-oriented reforms have gone ahead in those countries and, interestingly, have increased their power and control in their international relations. And that's the theme that's the first of the themes I'd like to pick up. And that's the real shift in power and control that's quietly going on in the global economy at present. And I'd like to just walk you through two major changes. So the first is about the rise of alternatives, the decreasing reliance of developing countries and emerging economies on the international organizations, which they seem to rely upon so deeply. Not just particularly when Krasner was writing, but also in the 2 decades subsequently. So if you think about it, until this century, any emerging market or developing country finance minister or central bank governor in the face of a financial crisis would very quickly find themselves, as for example, the Brazilian finance minister did in 1998, knocking on the door of the IMF to beg as a supplicant for assistance. Why? Because they had no other choice. If you take the case of Brazil, one of the reasons Brazil has another choice today is that since the 1997 East Asian crisis, those countries that can have developed their own self-insurance. So Brazil now sits on $360 billion worth of reserves. That's to say, Brazil alone sits on more reserves than the IMF had when Brazil had its last financial crisis and went to the IMF. That self-insurance, which we can see across Asia, across Latin America, and now beginning to grow in countries of Africa, is a first reason why what Krasner called the third world now have a genuine exit option. They have their own self-insurance. But a second reason, a second change has been the way in which those same countries have flirted with ideas of their own monetary arrangements, and obviously they've been clearest in Asia, to push for reforms within the institutions which Krasner thought they would never manage to reform. So we saw this most clearly after the East Asian crisis again. The minute Japan floated the balloon of an Asian monetary fund, and the minute other Asian countries began to put forward ideas of regional arrangements, both Washington and the IMF came up immediately with reforms of their own. One of those reforms was, of course, creating the G20 Finance Ministers Group, which would include emerging economies for the first time in that agenda-setting group. And we've seen those reforms, and we can pick them up in questions later, move across each of the formal international institutions, with emerging economies taking their places at many more tables. But a third alternative, and this one people have not been focusing on, but I think is a very interesting one, is the rise of their own regional development financing organizations. So if you look at the balance sheets of the World Bank and the regional development banks, there's no reason why any of you might possibly spend your weekends looking at the balance sheets of these organizations. But if you did, you would uncover something rather interesting, which is that in every one of those regions, the regional development bank has doubled its non-concessional lending. It's doubled the lending that it's doing to fee-paying clients. In every one of those regions, the World Bank has halved its fee-earning lending. What we see in the World Bank is that the World Bank's concessional lending is what's driving their lending up in those regions, but that's the lending that the World Bank makes no money from. It's the lending that relies on the largesse of donors, and those donors are starting to turn off that tap, forcing the bank to rely, as has happened in previous periods, on its own fee-paying clients. But the bank has been completely overtaken by regional development banks and even by national development banks. The Brazilian National Development Bank is now lending several times what the World Bank is lending globally, just one national development bank. And the sources of this can be seen. Let me just give you one example of why this is happening. Take the case straight after the 2008 crisis, when you'll recall that global trade dried up. For one country on the African continent, Botswana, a pretty well-run country, middle-income country, pretty good economic policies, pretty good standard of governance, their income, their revenue, mainly from diamonds, dried up overnight. And Botswana desperately needed a short-term bridging loan. It wasn't facing a solvency crisis. It was a genuine liquidity crisis, and it just needed short-term money. So Botswana went to the World Bank and said, you know, we've broken our arm. We're in an emergency. Can you do a loan for us? And the World Bank at the time was desperately trying to speed up its loan process and said, well, we could probably do it in about 16 or 17 months. That's a long time to sit in the waiting room or in an accident and emergency room. Meanwhile, the African Development Bank, hearing about this, moved straight into action, and within 3 weeks had delivered a $1.5 billion bridging loan to Botswana. That's telling us both something about the regional development banks and something about the slowness and difficulty that the bank had moving after the crisis. My point is that it's telling us about this strengthening regional governance and this real weakening of the center. It's a weakening of the center in monetary governance. It's a weakening of the center in development finance. And alongside this, we can see some underlying economic trends which are really interesting. If you look at global trade figures, and don't just look at how much global trade in each of these regions is increasing, but look at how much of that is intra-regional. How much trade is starting to occur within each region. And we find that in Africa, in Southern and Central America, and in the Middle East, intra-regional trade has doubled over the last decade. That's a very interesting trajectory. It's only in North America and in the European Union that we can see intra-regional trade declining. So this first change really is about a rise in power and influence of what Krasner called the Third World, which has been fueled by their economic growth and then fueled more than anything else by the emergence of these exit options that each of them are now enjoying. And of course, alongside this has gone a stagnation and paralysis in North America and, or I should say, in the United States and in the European Union. The 2008 crisis was a huge dent for the ideas, particularly in financial deregulation of the Europeans and Americans. But even more importantly, it's now reoriented what had been global institutions. And nowhere is that clearer than in the case of the IMF, where today 89% of the IMF's outstanding loans are to Europe. That's 89% of their outstanding loans from their general resource account are to countries in Europe. These two facts are interesting, not least, let me just quote something that Krasner wrote in 1985. And I think his logic was the logic of his book is powerful and interesting and informative. But the import of what I'm saying, I think, is highlighted by this quote. He wrote in 1985, "The gap between northern and southern capabilities," and he meant in international capabilities as well as domestic, "The gap between North and South is already so great that even if the countries of the South grew very quickly, and even if those of the North stagnated, a very unlikely pair of assumptions," he wrote, "only a handful of developing countries would significantly close the power gap within the next 100 years. We've moved very fast in global governance terms in the 30 years since that was written." But I'd like to move finally in these remarks to a third change, which I think is equally compelling for students of global governance. And that's a change in the legitimacy on how we think about legitimacy in countries of what Krasner called the Third World and in countries of what he called the North, between North and South. Because Krasner, don't forget, in 1985 was writing against a backdrop of authoritarian and military governments in every region, in South and Central America, in Asia, in Africa. And what we've seen since he wrote his book is not just waves of democratization across each of these continents. Not linear waves, certainly. We've seen detours, regressions back, military coups and such like. But we've seen an opening up of governments in a very large number of countries that's now being accelerated by social media, by transparency, by new initiatives to make governments more accountable. And I think we've seen the latest surge of this since 2008. I think what we've seen since 2008 is a smashing of a lazy compact that persisted for the decade until the financial crisis, which was that decade of easy money, easy growth, easy mortgages, easy jobs, which led to citizens, whether in this country or in Europe or in North Africa or in South America, turning a blind eye to the incompetence or corruption of their governments in exchange for secure jobs and wealth. When that broke, when the government's part of the bargain broke with the financial crisis, we very quickly saw the ricochet, not just in Tunisia, in Libya, in Egypt, but in Occupy Wall Street, Occupy the City, in the fair and free election campaigns of Moscow, in the pro-democracy activist campaigns in Beijing, and this summer, more recently, in the large-scale demonstrations across both Brazil and Chile. The outcomes have been messy, but I think what has been broken is the impunity that governments enjoyed when Krasner wrote Structural Conflict. And the breaking of that impunity, I think, spells something important for global governance. But let me move for a minute to the other side of the equation. The other big change that's occurred is, of course, in international organizations. When Krasner was writing, organizations like the IMF, the World Bank, and the GATT were deeply secretive. As somebody that was doing research on these institutions in the early 90s, I can tell you, it was impossible to get documents and data. One had to hang around corners of 19th Street in Washington, D.C. and try to persuade unlikely-looking board members that they should let you read their documents. I remember reading a copy, the Whittam report, actually, not public. I remember persuading a board member to let me read this document. And he invited me into his office and said, yes, I could read it. But then he got very, very nervous, and he had a great big desk like this, and said he was worried somebody would see. So would I get under the desk? Because it had a sort of wooden thing. So I can still remember sitting under this wooden desk, crouched in a ball, reading the Whittam report and desperately trying to take notes on it. That report's still not public, and it makes rather good reading, so that's a pity. But so much is now public. There's so much that you can now get off the internet. There is so much more engagement, and that didn't begin until 1994, 95, when each of these organizations began to feel that they had to have policies on disclosure. They had to engage with civil society organizations. They had to start being public about their deliberations, being public about their agreements with governments, and urging governments in turn to be public about what governments were agreeing to do with them. So that's all changed. So what does that mean for the balance? In the mid-80s, there was a pretty clear balance drawn by Western scholars, which was these are authoritarian governments suppressing people and interested in wealth, power, and control, but particularly power and control and wealth for their own purposes. And therefore, there's quite a lot of legitimacy to encouraging global institutions to intervene on behalf of people and their rights. But what does that look like today? Let me just give you what I think is the most positive case that people make for global governance setting norms for individual countries. And that would be a case in health. So think about the Millennium Development Goal 6, which is to combat HIV/AIDS and malaria. And picture a wealthy donor organization in collaboration with very well-resourced foundations, committing to give a poor country funding to combat or to treat HIV/AIDS infected people. The donors want to ensure, and it's in keeping with the spirit of the Millennium Development Goals, the donors want to ensure that governments put this issue at the top of their agenda. So to make sure that governments do, in this case, the donors want to require the government to match the funding that the external donors are putting in, dollar for dollar. And they want the government to make real commitments to deploy the government's resources, nurses, doctors, health facilities, to this priority. And this indeed has happened, and it's happened with terrific effects for the treatment of HIV/AIDS in a lot of countries. But what about when we look at the trade-offs? What about when we ask about those places where the budgets and resources that got stripped to do that were for maternal mortality, or for building better roads, or reducing traffic accidents, or offering special facilities to children who were otherwise unable to access them? What do we think about those citizens who have been stripped of provision because of this other priority? This is no different to the kind of case that every government in the world faces in making healthcare choices. Which group to treat and which group not to treat, because no budget is infinite and the trade-offs are very difficult and sharp. So who is it that should decide that trade-off? The case is robustly made in global health governance that it's international foundations well-intentioned international foundations together with other international partners? I'm not so sure. Because what about those whose treatment is removed in the face of this new priority? And who do they hold to account for that decision? Because if it's their own government that they can most easily hold to account, if the government is not acting with impunity, but in some imperfect, usually, way, can be held to account, then surely that's exactly what the democratic process is there to do. It's there to decide those priorities and to offer some accountability, having made that decision on those priorities. What recourse, I'm asking, does a small community in Zambia that feels dispossessed by this new priority or that has suffered greatly because of it, what recourse do they have to PEPFAR or USAID or the Gates Foundation? And is their recourse not easier to their own government? Who should make those choices? Now, some, of course, would argue that multilateralism can be democracy enhancing. In fact, Professor Cohen and his co-authors Macedo and Moravchik have done so. And I'm not going to run through their entire case, but I'm going to throw in 3 questions or places where I would differ from the case that they make, that we should think about multilateralism as democracy enhancing. And the first place would be the definition of multilateralism as reciprocal influence. Because I think that only works if you're looking at the transatlantic community. Whereas for most developing countries, it still remains the case today that their multilateral engagement is not reciprocal. Indeed, for every decision that is made in the G20, there are 175, or rather, somewhere between 175 and 180 other countries who are not part of that deliberation, many of whom then have to live with the consequences of it. Secondly, I wouldn't assume that multilateral fora are more immune from vested interests than national politics, and that's a theme I'm going to pick up in tomorrow's lecture. But to highlight what I mean there, take the case of financial regulation, where the Basel Committee is a government forum meeting in Basel to deliberate on international financial standards. In the wake of the financial crisis, I, just after the crisis, rang the Basel Committee, rang the BIS, to find out when the next Basel Committee meeting was. And I was told this is not publicly available information. I couldn't disclose this to the public. I asked for the agenda of the Basel Committee meeting and was told this was certainly not disclosed to the public. So I gave up and put down the phone. And then I rang a friend who works in a large investment bank and said, I'd really like to know when the next Basel Committee meeting is and what's on the agenda. And he said, oh, I'll send it to you. And it just highlights the point that the privacy of old that's persisting in some international organizations does not protect them from vested interests. Although there's a serious siege mentality at the moment not to be seen to be talking to the private sector. But it doesn't protect them. On the contrary, it simply keeps out the sunshine of the rest of the public gaze. A third, I guess, way that I would look at differently is to imagine that deliberative democratic processes in countries will right the excesses of multilateral organizations. So an example that's given in the multilateralism as democracy enhancing paper is the case of TRIPS, very interesting case, where TRIPS, the intellectual property agreement, had been agreed and was seen by many, and there was a very effective NGO campaign because the agreement that had been reached was seen immediately to have likely consequences on the accessibility of affordable drugs in developing countries. And so, as the multilateralism authors quite rightly point out, the public outcry produced a new declaration. And in that declaration, there is explicit flexibility. So here's a global governance statement which gives flexibility to the poorest countries of the world. So that's the deliberative democracy getting us that far. But let me point out that since that statement, what's really interesting about the outcomes subsequently is that a large number of the very poorest countries in the world, far from using that statement's flexibility, have ended up signing TRIPS plus agreements. And the same is happening in financial regulation, where a surprising number of very poor and low capacity countries have already signed up to Basel II, even though they don't have to, and even though they don't know what the consequences of it are likely to be for them. So I confess that I'm more skeptical that multilateralism can be democracy enforcing. And I think the upshot of my argument about legitimacy and its balancing is that it is a delicate balance on some issues and in some countries, but we need to think about that rebalancing now very seriously, with the consequence that in some areas global governance should be doing less. In some areas, it is no longer legitimate to have certain things on the global governance agenda. So let me finish just by saying my answer to my question, why question global governance in the 21st century, is because global governance is changing. A few years ago, participation in global governance was voluntary for a very small number of very powerful states and involuntary for the rest. And the result was what, and Bob gave me this lovely term, the result was monopolistic global governance. And it's that monopoly that's now eroding. And it's eroding, I think, faster than people have been predicting. Interestingly, this, I think, combines with almost the reverse of what Krasner predicted, which was that there would be a rejection of market opening, a seizing of power and control, and a holding on to that for influence. And what we've ended up seeing is growth, the emergence of alternatives, and an empowerment of the South in quite important ways because they've got exit options. What I'd like to do in my lecture tomorrow is to look into the consequences of these twin changes, this change, this erosion of monopoly power, and this rebalancing of legitimacy, and address in particular how global governance in this new form and with this new agenda could be made to work better. But I'd like to stop now and take your questions. Thank you. Sure. Yeah. Harold, I think there's a microphone.
Thank you. That was just a wonderful presentation, and I was very, very convinced by it. I wondered, when you pointed to the global financial crisis as a turning point or a triggering moment when the confidence is beginning to collapse, whether you might not be more explicit about this. I mean, I thought particularly the example you gave about Europe and the IMF is really a stunning one. A couple of weeks ago, the Wall Street Journal published the minutes of the meeting in May 2010 for the first Greek package. And all the Europeans and the United States voted for it, but the emerging markets all voted against it. So the question is, given this package, with a sum that really unusually for the IMF is actually not likely to be repaid, whether this isn't a kind of explosive delegitimization of the institution. The other area that I think of in terms of an explosive delegitimization is the fallout that we've had from the Edward Snowden revelations. The high point, I think, of global governance, the high watermark, the really successful moment was the G20 in London in April 2009. But we now know that the people who were participating in this were fed directly into the intelligence networks. It's deeply discrediting of the whole process. And it seems to me to really push for a dramatic crisis of global governance. We're seeing it in transatlantic relations, but it's on a wider scale. And it's more explosive, I would think, even than you argue, and you're pretty worried about it.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Harold. I think the change could already be seen before the 2008 crisis. When Britain chaired the G8 in 2005, the Gleneagles G8, I remember very clearly going down to help the British government do some preparatory thinking about the G8 earlier in that year. And there was a lively, other European members of the G8 were at the meeting. And there was a very lively debate about whether China should be invited to participate in the G8 of 2005. And the arguments around the table from the governments involved were the ones you would expect. Of course, China should not be part of the G8. China doesn't share our values. China doesn't share our mechanisms for sharing information. There's no background for this. In retrospect, that was a pretty interesting set of ideas because the G8 went on at Gleneagles to promise to double aid to Africa and to dramatically reduce Africa's debt burden. The G8 did not end up doubling aid to Africa. But interestingly, China did subsequently. And furthermore, only 1 year after that G8, China convened its summit of African leaders in Beijing and had 44 African heads of government and heads of state in Beijing and announced its own packages for those countries. So the explosion of China onto the scene in 2005 was one precursor. But the other part of your argument, the other part of your point about 2008 therefore was not a break, but it was a huge acceleration of that process. I remember, and I think you were at the IMF World Bank meetings in Istanbul a year after the crisis, Harold, and I remember chairing a session with an American official, the Mexican and Brazilian central bank governors at the time, that resulted, it was a very, very lively session because the US official, somewhat ill-advisedly, decided to lecture his emerging market counterparts on reforms he thought they should make to their institutions. And they just leapt out of their seats, and I'd never, ever seen this happen ever before from emerging markets towards a US official, and just said, this is ludicrous. Our institutions have survived the crisis and yours have crashed. So don't, it's not your place to lecture us and such like. Very lively debate. So that to me was the end of the spell of the Washington hold, as it were. Now what's happening with the IMF in Europe is of real concern to other developing countries. What the emerging markets are concerned about is that as the IMF lends most of its own core capital, that's to say the money that member governments lodge in the fund, as it uses those funds to lend to Europe, if a crisis occurs somewhere else, the fund will have to activate its special arrangements to borrow. And those special arrangements to borrow are arrangements which Brazil, Russia, India, and China now have a veto over using, which brings a really interesting politics to the next extra-European crisis. But for most of the world that I talk to in emerging economies and developing countries, the IMF, always seen as European dominated, is now Europe's own institution. And that's not said with complacency, because with the tapering of QE in the United States, emerging markets are really feeling the heat. And the likelihood of there being a financial crisis outside of Europe is high. And so the need for a multilateral pool is still important.
That was a very challenging talk, Ngaire. But there's a tension, I think, between your first major point and your third. The first major point is that formerly developing countries, rapidly growing emerging economies, now have more options. They have more alternatives. They don't have to rely so much on the IMF, the World Bank, the monopolistic entities of the rich countries. But the last theme was that these countries are oppressed still by having to rely on those entities. And it seems to me that that's in tension with each other. That is, if it were the case that the dominance of these entities was what was making multilateralism less democracy enhancing, then surely the reduction of asymmetries of interdependence and power is going to make them more democracy enhancing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, it's Bob always finds the chink and manages to shine light on it. The first argument is about the formal international organizations and if we take Krasner seriously, the surprising shift in those organizations. The second argument is about not just the conditionalities of those organizations, but about the intrusions of other coalitions in global politics. And your argument, your point is absolutely right that for many of these countries, there are now other options on that front as well. They can take large loans from China. They can take loans from Brazil. There's now moves afoot to create a BRICS bank and a Bank of the South. There are new alternative sources of finance. But still in the social area, in the area of the Millennium Development Goals, there is, and in no area more than in HIV/AIDS funding, there is a heavy, heavy reliance on international funding. And it's worrying because for HIV/AIDS treatment funding, nobody has an exit strategy. So the policy is assuming that either we're on the brink of a cure for the disease and or that Western donor funding will continue, which it's highly unlikely to. And those are the issues that have actually sat outside those formal institutions on the whole. But I think you're absolutely right that I need to think more about the way these mesh together.
Thank you very much, Professor Ngaire, for your very insightful lecture. I really learned that, so I really appreciate it. I have two questions. The first question is you mentioned about Botswana, that kind of financial crisis, and then the African Bank came to help. So that kind of regionalization progress. I was wondering, what's the relationship between regionalization and globalization? Does with the development of regionalization, does that mean we'll delay or facilitate globalization? This is my first question. The second question is concerned about, you mentioned in your lecture, there are so many financial regulations in the world, but why these regulations cannot still prevent international financial crisis? In the 1990s, there was a financial crisis, but in a decade later, 2008, another financial crisis at the international world. So I was wondering, the international financial crisis regulations, their role in the international financial governance, and what's the relationship with domestic, the national financial regulation with the international financial regulation? This is my two questions. Thank you very much.
Great questions. Regionalization and globalization. So it's kind of age-old debate about whether increasing regionalization will be a building block or a stumbling block to greater globalization. But I was intrigued looking at the numbers that I said that I mentioned earlier about the increase in intra-regional trade, the doubling of intra-regional trade. Because if that trend continues, then regionalization and globalization are going to proceed apace. But the regionalization is not necessarily going to fuel trade across regions. It is at the moment. I'm talking about where the trends are going to take us. On the financial regulations issue, sorry, on the other thing I want to say about regionalization and globalization is that in some areas, regions are definitely seeing regional organization as a better way to protect from globalization and mitigate the impacts of globalization. So in some cases, there's a clear, so if we look at the development of regional, whether it's pooling arrangements or whether it's financing, development financing arrangements, then that's very much protection against having to go global. Why did financial regulations not prevent the crisis, a subject that many have written at great length about? I guess the point I would make, that I think people have made less of, is that although finance started going global, governments started taking policies to permit, deregulatory policies to permit finance to go global, starting right back in 1967, there have never been, and still are, no global regulations. What we have is a set of standards. And quite a lot of those standards have actually been privatized and are taken forward by private networks. So, and I think there's an interesting imbalance between the enforceable legal market opening measures which have been applied to financial sectors through the World Trade Organization. So it's a legal instrument with adjudication and enforcement that forces markets open, and absolutely no equivalent on the prudential regulatory side. You would expect, if you're creating markets, that you're also doing the prudential regulation. The history of banking tells us why. And yet there has been this persisting imbalance right up till now. And there's still no global financial regulation on the table. We call it regulation. There's global standard setting, but there's no global financial regulation on the table. So regulation is all at the national level.
Thank you for your talk. It's very interesting. You have not yet discussed, we might call it the globalization of industry and the flow of jobs and industries from, we'll say, North America to Latin America to Asia, possibly even to North Africa. Could you discuss that, please?
Right. And you're absolutely right. I haven't dealt with that. I think it's the one argument against globalization that gets very well aired in this country and increasingly in Western Europe. And I don't think there's much I would add to the debates that have been held on it. Obviously, there's some quite good econometric work telling us which sectors are likely to suffer from that, and they're not the ones that are always in the political rhetoric of our policymakers.
It was indeed a fascinating lecture, Ngaire. Thank you. Lots to think about. I wanted to ask you if you could be a little clearer about what counts as global governance and what doesn't. You've given examples of international regimes, you've given examples of gatherings of world leaders, regulatory systems, but you clearly don't believe that regional organizations count as global governance. And I'd like you to defend that choice, because when you think about some of the international organizations you've talked about, even though they may be formally central, which seems to be your criterion, they have, as you've pointed out beautifully, often privileged some countries rather than others. and been more open to some countries than to others. So they also have their sort of partial qualities. So why couldn't we say that if you are distinguishing it from national sovereignty, regional organizations that are effective and that people are relying on, that are getting work done, why isn't that a kind of global governance also? And what's so sacred about the central?
And I think my answer is quite simple, and that's that the regional organizations and the alternatives to which I've referred have been explicitly created as a counter to the global organizations.
The central ones.
The central, yeah. So, I mean, the definition I would use of global governance is actually very much like the one that Krasner would use of international regimes, and other eminent authors here have used as well, about the norms, principles, decision-making procedures occurring at the global level. And, you know, you're right to say that that none of them include every single country in the world, and therefore on what basis am I distinguishing these regional organizations from the global one? And as I said, I think my first cut at that is it's subjective. It's that these regional organizations themselves are defining themselves against the global organizations.
Thanks.
Thanks for your talk. My name is Phil Hannum. I'm a PhD student here at the Woodrow Wilson School. One of the elements of your talk is the waning influence of the World Bank, which I think is apparent through many different metrics. But I want to focus on one of the examples that you used with regard to the competition it seemed that you were expressing between the regional development banks and the World Bank. So talking about Botswana's liquidity crisis and the responsiveness of the World Bank relative to the African Development Bank. I've also thought about that in the context of the World Bank's interactions with the Asian Development Bank when it comes to power plant development, particularly in China, India, elsewhere. These institutions share the same principles, to use that terminology. The U.S. Department of Treasury has the same office that overlooks both those institutions. The funding for the Asian Development Bank and the World Bank comes from the same place. Same thing for the African Development Bank. Do you really perceive those institutions to be in competition, or is it really a delegation of responsibility and these institutions expressing their comparative advantages?
It's a very good point. And the US plays a very different role in the regional development banks because it has so much smaller share. And the recent capital increases, so the biggest sign we get of the marginalization of the World Bank and the strengthening of these regional organizations lies in the fact that immediately after the financial crisis, the African Development Bank's capital was increased by 200%. The Asian Development Bank's capital was increased by 200%. The World Bank's capital was increased by 30%. So their relative shares, hugely different. And part of the answer was the drive by other members and the willingness to pay of other members. So the United States is not in the driving seat of the regional development banks. It's an important voice.
Thanks.
The other interesting point that I would highlight, since you've raised the World Bank, is that, interestingly, the new World Bank president, Jim Kim, is now embarking on a process to re-centralize the World Bank, to strengthen its global practices, that's to say its knowledge practices, and to shift away from the decentralization that has taken place over the last 15 years. For any student of the history of the bank, you will recognize immediately that this is something that happens in cycles, that each World Bank president comes in and realizes that there's always this tension between the bank specializing first on what it knows about issues and second on its country focus, or vice versa. Risks to the centralization policy at this point, precisely because of the changes that I've talked about in this lecture. And I think there is always a temptation when you sit in Washington, D.C., and you would prefer to believe that the world doesn't love you just for your money, but also for your ideas, which is the World Bank's idea that it be the knowledge bank, and this knowledge, that countries come to it to learn, not just to borrow. There's always a risk that you underestimate the fact that knowledge is best conveyed when the messenger is deeply trusted. And the messenger who sits in Washington, D.C., being the world's expert, is not necessarily going to be deeply trusted. We know from the experience of the last 20 years that the trusted messenger is more likely to be the bank official who's been in that country for 15 years through thick and thin, who the government knows understands what's feasible and what's not feasible and can offer advice that's informed by the local context. So the bank, it's going to be very interesting watching how it balances those challenges with what is an ambitious set of reforms.
Hi, thank you very much for this talk. It helps you think about a few things. Professor Deaton here makes an argument that loans from large institutions actually have a kind of a toxic effect on smaller countries where they don't have the local governance in place to administer these funds for development or stuff like that. So he makes this interesting argument that that these are actually detrimental to these countries. So that's one point. The other point would be that you said that you had trouble accessing these information in these private law. In these World Bank type structures. There's a lack of transparency. But if you just look at the recent financial crisis, the local private banks had, even at that, just before the financial crisis, they would have not. The debt market is kept secret. The information content is kept private. Only then you could have the markets functioning, right? So, but then you know what it led to, right? Mm-hmm. So, considering these two factors, perhaps there's a reluctance by developing countries to borrow large sums, okay? And that's one thing. And perhaps it could be that, just as another questioner pointed out, perhaps there should be a regional coalitions coming together before you could have true global governance. And yeah, that's my first question. Mm-hmm. The second question would be, what role do external factors like global warming or a threat of an asteroid impact precipitate global governance, if you will?
Mm-hmm. Thank you very much. Loans to poor countries. So I could take that question two ways. So one is about whether we're talking about private loans or we're talking about concessional and aid money going into these countries, and their difficulties in administering it. The difficulties, whatever the difficulties are in administering a grant, and any grant officer in a university would know the hell that pertains to administering research grants. In Europe, the European Union ones are particularly renowned. But you actually have to at least quadruple those difficulties when you think about developing country aid, because in one particularly standout study that the OECD did a decade ago, a group of 6 donors were requiring countries to report on more than 11 different standards. Think about the absolute craziness of that. You've got your research grant, if you're an academic. Let's say you've got one research grant, and that one grant giver is requiring you to do your accounts in 3 different ways just for them, because they in turn have to report perhaps to Parliament or to their Auditor General or to different parts of their own government. That's the pernicious effect. And that effect has been assailed by a decade of negotiations run in the OECD called the Paris process, which I regret to say are a hopeless, extraordinarily expensive process aimed at getting donors to harmonize and align their aid policies, with almost no positive progress, and a whole industry of every government's agency sending somebody off to these meetings, reporting back, tying down in this huge bureaucracy. So it's a really important point that you're raising, and it's one that will probably get resolved by developing countries simply taking loans from others. So it'll be the exit option, I think, that ends up solving that, much more than this long and fairly fruitless process of donors trying to coordinate among themselves. Yeah.
Shouldn't a trend of decommissioning global governance be a natural outcome of the system to show that it's working? I mean, shouldn't we all strive to have everyone have an equal play in the world economy?
Yes. Two different points, I think. Should we decommission global governance entirely? The alternatives to global governance, so the alternatives that I was talking about tonight, let's not, you know, and I didn't focus on this and perhaps should have, but these alternatives are costly. I mean, there is a very sound, rational argument for pooling reserves at the global level and for doing development assistance at the global level. So it's much cheaper for countries to contribute very small amounts to a global pool than it is for them to sit on hundreds of billions of reserves, each of them individually. It's undoubtedly the case, in theory, that to have a World Bank that can play global allocation on a global balancing framework is a very good thing, because the aid system creates donor darlings and donor orphans, which are not rational. Money floods to, say, Rwanda because it's flavor of the week or flavor of the year or the decade, and is starved of other countries. So the idea that you could have one global agency which is equilibrating the capriciousness of individual donors is a compelling one in theory. But of course, in practice, neither of those things happens, which is why countries are exiting. So I'm not saying there isn't a case for global governance. I'm saying it hasn't, what I'm saying in answer to you now is that it hasn't entirely delivered on those, as it were, transaction cost saving benefits for these countries, and therefore they have sought more costly alternatives.
Thanks very much for your talk. It was very thought-provoking. I guess my critique of it would be to focus on where you start with the Krasner thesis as a kind of angle. I think ironically you stick with his thesis in your own analysis, even though you're criticizing his predictions and you're saying they didn't flesh out. But you stick with his analysis that somehow, if the Asian Development Bank is the mechanism that solves a problem instead of the World Bank, that somehow there are losers in that, that the US should feel, or the Europeans should somehow feel jealous or incompetent if that were the case. And I just don't get that sense. And I think some of the other questions hinted at this before, that, that Washington or the European capitals are tremendously worried that emergency loans or financial assistance would flow from other sources besides themselves. I think they're much more concerned about the problem being solved so that it doesn't become a contagion effect across regions. So that would be my first comment. It's not really a question. I won't pretend that it is. The second thing is more about the trade figures, and I think it's related to the first. And that is the notion that there's regionalization as opposed to globalization on trade, I think misses what Helen Milner has written about so much, which is transnational production. That a lot of that intra-regional trade is really the fact that products in those regions, many of which are shipped out of the region, are assembled among multiple countries in parts. And the finance that comes in is often from outside the region. So I think it's actually a function of globalization to a large degree, especially capital flows, that you have so much intensity of regional trade. So they don't just move together on separate tracks. They're actually part of the same track, it would seem to me. Again, not a question. I apologize for making two statements.
And I agree with that point. I think regional value chains are a big part of that intra-regional story. I totally agree with that second point. I think on the
what
first...
about the jealousy thing? Because I really think the jealousy thing is at the core of your... I worked in the State Department and it just thankfully left right before the financial crisis.
Right.
It didn't happen because I left. Thankfully left before it, but I didn't see this kind of jealousy. I don't remember anybody saying, oh, China's meeting with African countries, or China will loan to African countries, or China will invest in Africa. And the media was constantly saying, oh, the US must be worried. But I don't recall the meetings where we sat around and said, what can we do to counter this? We didn't see it as a counter to us.
I guess I've seen more anxiety, sometimes hysteria around that issue, particularly in relation to Africa, and maybe it's just in Europe. But let me answer the underlying question that you've touched on, which is, should the United States and the European Union be alarmed at the marginalization of the IMF and World Bank? And my answer to that is an unequivocal yes, they should, because they rely on those organizations, and they rely on them in two ways. One, they absolutely rely on them because their own financial and other sectors are so global. But it's particularly when you look at financial services, and you realize you can't really send gunboats down anymore to expropriate from borrowing sovereigns. It's just not done. You send in the IMF, it's much more politically palatable. Of course, the next country with globalizing banks, if you look at what's happening in the banking sectors of China and Brazil, they will be the next global banking, next in line with global banking interests, which will need global enforcement. So they, in the end, will want an IMF that looks exactly what it looks like today, but for that same reason. But at the moment, we're still very much in a world where the financial, even since 2008, as many of you will be aware, cross-border capital flows have collapsed by 60%, which is huge. But they are starting to re-emerge, right? They are rebuilding. And it's the regulation and enforcement of relations around that you need the fund for. And likewise, the bank, and many others have made this argument, the bank has always been there, serving very important both geostrategic as well as other interests of the United States and Europe. If the United States and Europe decide that instead of working through these multilateral institutions, they want to do it on their own, they will also face an enormous bill. Because let's not forget, they contribute very little to the IMF and World Bank. What they contribute mainly is their own guarantee that if the institution goes bust, they'll stump up money. But both institutions live predominantly on what they earn. That's to say, what they earn from emerging economies. So if the US and Europe were going to foot that bill on their own, it would be both costly and far less effective.
I agree with you entirely, but this is why I think the lens is wrong. The problem is that the Chinese banks and the other banks in Brazil and other places where there's a lot of wherewithal are not contributing enough to the process. They don't have a big enough role in the process. So the solution, the problem isn't that they're going to have a bigger role and a bigger play, and they're going to undercut the power of the United States and Europe. The problem is they're not yet doing enough. And these other countries, because of globalization and common interests rather than a zero-sum power struggle, need them to do more and play a larger role get more leadership in the process, because their goals, as you say, are largely the same as the others. They're all part of the same global economy.
And tell me, if you were, so if you were Brazil, and by the way, Brazil, Russia, India, China have hugely increased their contributions to the fund, they were promised in response an increase in votes commensurate with what they were contributing, and they have still not received that. It's stuck in waiting for the US Congress to approve the change to the fund's Articles of Agreement. And it looks like it'll be stuck there for quite some time. Yes, well, exactly. Exactly. But I would put to you, if you were Brazil at the moment, would you really, if you had a large contribution to make towards your own and your region and global financial stability, and you wanted it to carry influence, would you really queue up to give it to the IMF? Or would you also be balancing having your own national, regional, or BRICS organization which you would have influence over? Might you not be scared that you'd put all the money in and it would go straight to Greece, as was earlier mentioned, and that then if a country in your region or even you had a crisis, there would be nothing left available for you and you wouldn't have a voice over that? I mean, would you not?
I'll take that question as rhetorical. It's a wonderful lead-in to your topic for tomorrow, which is less but better, making global governance work in the 21st century in both instances. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Bob, and thank you all.